by the time I get finished, you'll know that it's total, I don't know, fill in your words. These are my conclusions. I thought I'd put them first. First is that capturing 90% of CO2 with carbon capture is unproven. You may think it's a real thing, and in a sense it is a bit of a thing, but carbon capture is not as big a thing as the industry would have you believe. But it is a big crisis. It's a big gamble for solving the crisis, climate crisis. It will be very expensive. Making blue hydrogen from natural gas or coal will not be clean. We are releasing a report at 10 a.m. tomorrow entitled Blue Hydrogen, not clean, not low carbon, not a solution. I think you can probably get the idea of what our conclusions are. Relying on both will keep the world addicted to fossil fuels for decades and will lead to climate disasters that will make this summer look like a walk in the park without 100-degree temperatures. And there are other means for reducing our reliance on fossil fuels, wind, solar, storage, energy efficiency, for example. What is CCS? It's touted by the industry. In order to be effective, it has to capture all or nearly all of the CO2 that's produced by whether it's a power plant, hydrogen production facility, or an industrial process. We're in favor of studying CCS. It's a good idea. The rapid implementation that you've seen in Tom and Sean's presentations is not. Three key questions. How much of the CO2 can be reliably captured? How effective will it be over the long term? Nobody talks about the long term other than here. And the third is cost. You think from listening to the industry that there's a lot of experience with carbon capture. It's been around for a while, but as of the end of last year, there were 27, or maybe 28 facilities. Many have been canceled. A lot of money has been spent on canceled and failed projects. Out of the 27 projects, 2 coal plants, one of which was indefinitely mothballed, that's coming back to life, the owner says. The one coal plant that's continuing to operate, Boundary Dam in Saskatchewan, Canada, doesn't do very well, captures like half of it, a little more than half the CO2 it produces instead of the 90% they predicted. No CO2, zero, has been captured at a gas-fired power plant, commercial gas-fired power plant. There was a test just west of Boston back in the late 1990s, early 2000s, captured 40 tons a day of CO2 a day, a minimal amount. One steel plant in the world captures CO2. No public information about whether they capture 2% or 102% of their CO2. No concrete plant captures CO2. 3 hydrogen production facilities capture CO2. As you'll see, none of them have captured more than 68% of their CO2. Whoops, I think I turned it off. Sorry about that. That was it for my presentation. These are 11 projects, I think it's 11, last time I counted, that we've been able to find public information on how much CO2 they produce and how much they've captured. You see the 2 coal plants in the middle, the 3 on the left are the, well, it says hydrogen production, Quest project in Alberta, Canada. It's the big time winner among the 3. capturing 68% of the CO2 related to the entire project. Air liquide in France, 60%, and then air products in Texas is captured 40 to 50%. Some have done worse. A few natural gas processing is easier, so that they've done a little bit better overall. So if there's no real experience, what do proponents say to support their projects? First, they rely on the results of testing, but most of the testing is pretty small. What are considered large testing projects are only targeting capturing 5% of the CO2 from 2 coal plants. A test project that's only going to capture 1% of the CO2 from a large plant, gas-fired power plant in California, has been called a game changer. As I mentioned before, small-scale testing is important, but is not definite proof that when you scale these technologies up to large power plants, hydrogen production facilities, industrial plants, that they're going to capture more than 90 or 95 or more than 99% of the CO2 they create, and will be doing it year after year for decades. And finally, what proponents of plants rely on, and what the Department of Energy of the U.S. relies on, unsupported statements by the proponents, developers of CCS projects that have not yet been built and operated, almost all of which are not under construction, and some that haven't been funded yet. This is from a DOE study, and this is the data on which they based the assumption that a hydrogen production facility using steam methane reforming, the main technology used today, would capture 96% of the CO2 the production facility produces, and that plants using what's called ATR, autothermal reforming, a new process that's supposed to be easier to capture the CO2. No plant with ATR technology has been built. So if it's not been built, it couldn't have been operated. So it's basically estimates by those who have a self-interest in saying the plant's going to capture a lot of CO2. This chart, too many words, I apologize. I'm going to steal Sean's first chart for my webinar on Wednesday, on Thursday. I mentioned tomorrow we're releasing our report. Thursday we're having a webinar. If you're interested, everybody here is on our email list already. If not, give me your name and email address. When they talk about capturing 99.3% of the CO2 from a power plant or the hydrogen production facility, they're talking about just the plant. They're ignoring upstream leakage from methane from natural gas pipelines or coal bed methane that's released when you do coal mining. And they ignore downstream leakage, like from CO2 pipes or from the CO2 sequestration site. So they're just talking about the power plant. Now, I did an analysis last year that looked at, this is for a proposed carbon capture project at a coal plant that until last fall lived in northwestern New Mexico. It didn't move, it just was retired. And I assumed that they achieved a 95% capture rate, but they didn't capture any of the methane that was released when they did coal mining. We picked this plant not only because we were working with advocates in the area, but we had detailed information on how much methane was released from the mine that was next door that provided the coal for the plant. So when you include the methane from the plant, plus the methane, plus the CO2 from the power plant, the carbon capture rate, the effective carbon capture rate was only 72%. That's the best case. These are lower capture rates assumed. So if they only captured 65% from the power plant, basically they captured half of the total CO2 equivalents from the mine and the power plant. So you have to look at a life cycle analysis. What's been done so far with captured CO2? 75% has been done for enhanced oil recovery. Anybody here not know what enhanced oil recovery is? It's basically a way to produce more oil, which gets burned or used as a chemical feedstock, which releases CO2 into the air. Depending on your assumptions, it either means no net reductions in CO2 emissions when you capture CO2 and use it for EOR, or higher. It's got a minor side effect of causing earthquakes, and it leaks CO2 into the atmosphere. I've been working on CCS issues for 8 years now, researching and writing. One of my colleagues at IEFA looked at, and I'd only been looking at the CC, the carbon capture. My colleague Grant Tauber looked at the S, the storage or sequestration part of it. He looked at 2 projects that I can't pronounce the names of in Norway, off Norway, that are considered the prime examples of showing the world that CCS really works. It's basically stored under the North Sea. And it turns out that despite the fact that Norway, because they had a really high carbon, you asked the question about carbon tax. Norway has had a really high carbon tax. So it was profitable to spend a lot of money to store it underground. And they used state-of-the-art technologies, same as you used in oil, looking for oil to pump. Despite preparing extensive surveys using the state-of-the-art equipment, and they thought they knew what was going to happen, when they put the captured CO2 underground, were maybe 8 different levels of storage. Well, CO2 went to number 9. And once it's under there, I put maybe nothing because I was afraid somebody would think of a way you could do it. But basically, there's nothing you can do once you put the CO2 under there. And the problem is that the CO2 will migrate. There was a project in Algeria where they had studied extensively, but when they put the CO2 in, the ground level moved 11 inches. And the CO2 is still a mile underground, but it went to caverns that no one anticipated, causing the ground to buckle a bit. So the problem is the environmental issue is leakage, but there could be health and safety issues. Adding CCS to existing plants will take years and will be expensive. These are my 2 favorite lines I've come up with in writing on the subject since 2015. There's no one-size-fits-all design for carbon capture systems. Everyone's going to have to be designed to fit the plant. The especially for existing facilities, to fit the plant, power plant, et cetera, that they're being, is being added to. It's not like going to Home Depot and finding some retired guy wearing an apron and saying, excuse me, I want to put carbon capture on my coal-fired power plant. And he goes, oh, okay, it's over on aisle 10. Nope, that's not the way it works. It'll have to be specifically designed. I don't think we'll see an operating CCS retrofit or a new plant until 2028 or later. Looking at the DOE schedule that Tom showed up, I'd probably be significantly later than 2030. So we're wasting time when we need to act yesterday. There's an estimated cost of $2 billion to retrofit a 457 megawatt coal plant in North Dakota. When they started talking about it's called Project Tundra. When they started talking about it, the estimated cost was $1 billion. Blue hydrogen. Whoops, sorry about that. As we've already discussed, the BIL and the inflation IRA contain tens of billions of dollars in funding for hydrogen and CCS projects. Blue hydrogen, as you all know and we've talked about, is made from the methane and natural gas, coal, and maybe renewable natural gas. Our first report is just dealing with hydrogen produced from natural gas. We're going to do 2 follow-ups on hydrogen, blue hydrogen produced from coal, and then one on renewable natural gas. Both acts will mean extended lives for fossil fuel facilities and huge profits from government subsidies to the fossil fuel industries. The plant that I showed you back here, the one that was retired, if they'd only captured any of these, the 72% of the total CO2 that was emitted, they would have still gotten $450 million a year from taxpayers. Sorry for jumping. What counts as clean? The IRA and the Department of Energy have established a federal clean hydrogen production standard, CHPS, that defines clean hydrogen as that having a life cycle carbon intensity of less than or equal to 4.4 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. That includes methane, hydrogen itself, released into the atmosphere per kilogram of hydrogen produced. The 4-to-1 ratio. They could have put it in tons or ounces. It's just a 4-to-1 ratio. But the DOE says in its policy guidance document that it will fund projects even if they don't meet this standard, if they're somehow advancing the idea of producing clean hydrogen. What then is the purpose of having a standard if you're immediately told everybody you're going to violate it? What evidence do proponents have to prove blue hydrogen will be clean and low carbon? Not much. The proponents mostly just repeat the words hydrogen, clean, and or low carbon as often as possible, no matter what question they're asked, no matter what the circumstances. The DOE released its, I forget what it was called, but it was a takeoff plan for hydrogen back in March. They used the word clean That one was 360 times the word clean. In June, the federal government released a plan that included more than just the DOE. They included the word clean 499 times in a 111-page document, and they included the term clean hydrogen 118 times. They had one small little bar chart that showed the results of modeling that showed it would be clean. If you didn't know what it was, you wouldn't know that it was any evidence. DOE paid Argonne National Lab, which it runs, to develop a model called GREET, Greenhouse Gas Regulated Emissions for Energy and Transportation. It's an emission model that is sometimes used to show it's possible to produce hydrogen that meets the clean hydrogen production standard. The DOE says GREET is transparent and easy to use. It's about as transparent as that wall is, and it's extremely difficult to use because a lot of the cells, while they may be linked, they don't indicate the calculations that go into the cells. Yes, it is possible to produce hydrogen from a variety of fuels, clean hydrogen, including methane and coal, that will have carbon intensities that meet the federal GREET. It's only true for a limited set of extremely favorable assumptions. There is not much they can do from their set of the default assumptions. They can't make them much better. They've chosen about the best possible set of assumptions, but there's a lot of risk that the actual real world will be a lot worse. What did we do? We ran 100 different assumptions using the GREET model and to examine whether, in fact, the carbon intensity of blue hydrogen from natural gas could meet the clean standard. You got a question, Sean? You look puzzled.
No,
I don't want to leave
I'm
anything.
puzzled. I'm waiting.
Okay, you're waiting? Okay. The four key assumptions that the DOE used in the GREET model. They assumed a 100-year global warming potential for methane and no global warming potential for hydrogen. Why is that significant? Methane and hydrogen are short-term. They only live in the atmosphere for 10 to 20 years. Methane, though, its short 20-year global warming potential is 88 times that of CO2. Its 100-year is 30 times that of CO2. Methane has a dramatic impact on global warming, but it's over the short term. But it's continuously being emitted. So it's not like after 20 years there's no more methane. It's constantly being emitted into the atmosphere. Hydrogen is not a direct greenhouse gas, but it affects how long methane stays in the atmosphere. I won't go into the chemistry for you. But a model of the production process for producing a product, hydrogen, doesn't consider the impact of the product it produces on global warming. It's insane. I did this report with my colleague Annika June, and she was more willing early on. We've been working on this for 8 months, maybe 8 by now. After a few months, she said they picked assumptions that would make it look like the hydrogen was clean. And I said, no, they're scientists and engineers. I'm pretty cynical, but I believe there's scientists and engineers, and it just so happened it worked out that way. No. Okay, so the average methane emission rate into the atmosphere done by scientists who believe in global warming is roughly 2.5% of the total methane that's produced at the well. Wheat uses a 1% methane rate. It is assumes, as I mentioned before, 95 to 96% of the CO2 produced by the production facility is captured, and then last but not least, they ignore all downstream emissions from the production facility. So while it's called a life cycle analysis, it's only part of the life cycle. I've been absolutely struggling for an analogy to describe it. And Annika, who has a 14-year-old, my daughters are too old, I don't remember this. It's like telling your teenager to clean their room, and when you go in and you say, well, it's dirty, it's still dirty, and they say, well, I cleaned 60% of it. Doesn't that count as a full cleaning? I mean, it's just dishonest. Okay, this chart uses all the 4 favorable assumptions I mentioned. Low global warming potentials, low emission rate for methane, no downstream emissions, and goes the gamut from, these are the 2 technologies I mentioned before. No capture, no CO2 capture to the default rate. You can see that as they capture more from 0 to 96.2, the carbon intensity does go down. The dots are the federal standard. Now, given, if you remember back to the bar chart I showed of the real world experience, I mean, 70% would be a pretty good jump from the 60 and 50s that are being achieved in carbon capture rates to date. 85% would be magnificent. Even if they capture 94%, 1.5% of the CO2 for the ATR technology, it still won't be clean under the federal standard. It'll still be above it. So these are all their assumptions other than we added the 70% and 85%. These are our assumptions. Higher methane leakage rate, 20-year global warming potentials, because the problem is here today. I mean, I don't have to tell any of you the summer the world has had. Maybe 20, 30 years ago, it made sense to think, well, it's going to happen in the future. We'll worry about 100 years in the future. Now, we don't have that luxury. And we looked at a range of carbon capture rates. Under none of them, the scenarios we looked at with these assumptions is blue hydrogen clean or low carbon. In some of them, it's 4 times as high as the federal standard. Now, these are not our worst case assumptions. This assumes a 2.5% methane emission rate and a very small downstream emission rate, just to have something in the model. There's no data. Hydrogen not only is an indirect greenhouse gas, it's the smallest molecule that can escape anywhere. And it's the detection equipment they use is for big leaks because they're dangerous. So until very recently, there's been no technology for detecting the small leaks from which hydrogen can escape from piping, compressors, power plants, the whole value chain. There's really no credible number, so that when you look at scientific studies, they consider the impact of a range of leakage from 1 to 10%. And even then, they don't know that 10% is the top. So this is my contact information. We're releasing the report tomorrow. Thursday, we're having a webinar. We have a website, and AIFA does a lot of research on a lot of topics. But the bottom line is reasonable assumptions. It's really dirty. So when Sean talked this morning about how expensive it's going to be, it's not even, I could understand it being expensive if it was going to make the world better. And I think, Tom, that this is a reason why they don't want to give information out about individual projects. Because under the Inflation Reduction Act, they're supposed to be getting an analysis using this GREET model from every applicant. I can't believe they got all that information from applicants for all these projects and that they've analyzed it. So they probably want to keep that. Either they didn't get the information or they never analyzed it. Secret from the public. Any questions?
I'm just really struck. I'd like to bring this back around to the finances too. Is Reed Fraser's gone. Earlier, Reed Fraser asked a question, about the markets, investors, and their willingness to invest in this stuff. David has raised two really critical issues. One is capacity factors, how much do these things really run, and the other one is capture rates. Now, when you think, Reed's question was basically, well, are investors going to be willing to take the risk on this stuff, to put their money into this stuff? Both of the issues that David raises really compounds the risk seriously, because if you've got a fixed cost to install carbon capture on a power plant or even a hydrogen production facility, and the question is, what volume are you going to be able to recover that cost over? If you don't have a really high capacity factor, you got a real problem in recovering your cost. And similarly, because the IRA is back-end loaded, you get the money for the carbon that you capture. If we're seeing carbon capture rates not of 90 or 95%, but if we're seeing 70% carbon capture rates, that cuts directly into the revenue that plant can earn. And investors have to be thinking about that. It's like, yeah, you're telling me I'm going to get an $85 per ton subsidy, but what if our capture rate is only 3/4 what you're advertising? That is a real issue for investors, and that's part of the reason that we saw Ernie Moniz and Energy Futures Initiative saying even the $85 isn't enough. And even in cases where the actual physical cost of capture may only be $40 or $50 a ton, 85 still isn't enough oftentimes, and it's because in part of concerns like those that David is raising. And so it goes full circle. It's both environmental. Reed, I just paid homage to you. No, but I was pointing out, you had asked earlier about investors and their willingness to take advantage of this. David has raised two critical issues, which are capacity factors and capture rates, actual capture rates. If as an investor, because those subsidies are back-end loaded, if you don't have confidence that you're going to capture 90% plus of this stuff, you're gonna be very hesitant to invest because your projected revenue shrinks rapidly.
When the IRA was first proposed, there was a standard that anyone who would get, any applicant for funding for the production tax credits would have to show that their project was going to achieve 90% capture. The industry said, who had been saying, oh, we're gonna do 98%, 99%, well, wait a minute, we're not sure we can do it. So the standard got lowered. The EPA is now considering a clean power plan by which carbon capture would be the standard against which other measures to reduce CO2 would be measured. And the utility industry is going bananas. All these companies that have been claiming 98, 99% are saying now, the testing is too small scale, it's not long enough, we're not sure it'll happen, it won't be reliable for a big plant. I mean, they have no shame. I have no shame because now I'm using their quotes about it not working, which is the same stuff we said before.
Yeah. This shines a really great light on another question, which is, you know, the IRA and the BIL try to incent this activity with carrots, not with sticks. The stick, of course, would be a carbon tax. When you think about it, right, for carbon capture, we want to give people $85 a ton. Meanwhile, in Pennsylvania in particular, when people talk about RGGI, you hear the industry and others complaining that if a $13 per ton fee were applied through RGGI, my God, it would make energy horrifically expensive. Meanwhile, they're saying, hey, $85 a ton in subsidies is just absolutely great. And it's in part, it's a question of who would have to pay.
I mean, I have compassion for the Biden administration, even though I think they've funded they're about to fund projects that not only are going to be rip-off taxpayers and consumers, but be destructive in the environment over the long term. They had to get by Manchin. They needed the 51 votes, and they didn't have much wiggle room to do it. But it's not going to be clean. Secretary Granholm runs around the country and just says clean hydrogen. Now, this analysis focuses on blue hydrogen from natural gas. The fact that this GREET model excludes downstream hydrogen, the impact makes me seriously doubt